Hi, we previously looked at Buddhist philosophy, focusing on its denial of the existence of the self. What we'll do now is look at Nyaya philosophy, which responds to Buddhism, specifically focusing on the self and presenting several arguments in favor of the existence of the self. It's suitable at this point to take a step back and consider Indian philosophy overall, and the different traditions that make up Indian philosophy. First, there's the Vedic tradition from which Hinduism arose. This is the tradition under which Nyaya philosophy is situated, but it's important to note that there's many other schools in the Vedic tradition that would dispute some of the claims made by Nyaya philosophy. Second, there's Buddhism, and once again, there are a variety of schools under Buddhism that have deep disagreements. Third, there's Jainism, likewise with a couple of different schools. And finally, Islam was introduced to India, and so there developed philosophical thought stemming from an Islamic orientation. Let us now look at Nyaya philosophy specifically. Nyaya philosophy began with the philosopher Gautama, who lived in the 2nd century of the Common Era. And so what Gautama had done was write a sutra, a series of aphorisms or statements that built upon one another relatively systematically, but these needed much more explanation and development. And so followers of Gautama provided commentaries explaining various statements of Gautama, giving arguments and systematizing the thought. And what does that thought consist in or focus on? Really, Nyaya is distinctive because it focuses on reasoning, argument, and debate. So Nyaya largely consists in an inquiry about what counts as good reasoning versus bad reasoning, what counts as good rules or procedures for debate versus ones that are bad. So it focuses a lot on epistemology and logic, how we can acquire good knowledge through reasoning. But it's to be noted that it's not limited to epistemology. It also engages with metaphysics and largely tries to defend common sense metaphysics, so largely tries to defend the way that we normally talk about things, talk about the world and what exists, unlike Buddhist philosophy that denies the existence of a lot of different things. And likewise, Nyaya philosophy will engage in ethical concerns as well. As I just said, the Nyaya tradition has a lot of commentators, and so there are many, but we're mostly going to focus on 2, Vatsyayana and Udatakara. I'm probably not going to pronounce these names very accurately, but that's how it is. Hopefully you'll know who I'm talking about. There are other commentators, and I'll at least once mention Udayana as offering something important for our purposes. And recall, our purposes will be focusing on the self. But before focusing on the self, we need to get some background with respect to the general orientation of Nyaya thought. So the first sutra of Gautama says, quote, knowledge sources, objects of knowledge, doubt, motive, example, accepted position, so on and so on. From knowledge of these various things, there is attainment of the supreme good, end quote. So notice what Gautama says. He gives a bunch of different examples of ways of knowing, ways that we can know things, and likewise various ways of talking about what's true and what's false. And what Gautama wants to do is look at these sources of knowledge, these ways of talking, and figure out what will lead to good results, what will lead to us getting at the truth, and that will help us be led to the supreme good. Vatsyayana helpfully summarizes this thought in his commentary, where he says, quote, when an object is comprehended through a knowledge source, it becomes possible to engage in successful goal-directed activity. So notice we're focusing on knowledge source specifically. So all those things in Gautama's list, or at least most of them, can be classified as knowledge sources. And we care about sources of knowledge because having knowledge will help us succeed in various efforts in our lives, help us succeed with respect to our action. So what this means is that Nyaya philosophy, although it focuses on knowledge, it focuses on knowledge in part because it can help us lead good lives. That is to say, because there's ethical concerns that we want to achieve. But let us focus on that notion of knowledge source. Now, the term here that's originally used is pramana, and that means something like a method, a reliable one for producing true beliefs. So what we're doing here is looking at the various ways that our beliefs are produced. Some of these might be very conscious, when you're engaging in very conscious deliberation, reasoning to arrive at a certain belief, and some can be unconscious, that you just form through cognitive processes that are unknown to you, you form beliefs. And what Nyaya is supposed to do is identify the good ones, and only those good ones are going to count as pramana, as genuine knowledge sources. So knowledge is going to be something that's a true belief, but with something more. It's produced through a reliable mechanism of some sort. And for Nyaya philosophy, there are roughly 4 different processes that can lead to knowledge. They're perception, inference, analogy, and testimony. And Nyaya will say quite a bit about each of these, but I'll just give a very brief summary. So perception results, Gautama says, when, quote, there's a connection of sense faculty and object that doesn't depend on language, is inerrant, and is definitive, end quote. So the basic idea there is that we have some sense faculty, like sight, touch, and so on, that directly connects to an object. And it gives you an awareness of that object, not through language, but just through the direct experience through that sensation. Now, inference is not going to be direct like perception, but rather indirect. It depends on you having prior experiences, prior perceptions, and then you relate those different experiences or perceptions to one another and reason about what to conclude, what to believe. And that's what an inference is. It's inferring something, concluding something on the basis of past experience and maybe present experience as well, but coming to a belief about something that isn't directly known, isn't directly obvious to your experience. Then we have analogy, where you're comparing different things and you recognize various similarities between them, and you use those similarities to come up with knowledge or true belief. And then finally, testimony is where you get knowledge or true beliefs through other people, through what they say. And so what we want to do with each of these knowledge sources is figure out when we use them well, when we use them poorly. So a good question here is, when someone tells you something, when do you believe it? When is it right to trust what somebody else says? Do we rely on the person's character? Do we rely on figuring out what that person says relates to one's own past experiences? What else do we use to figure out whom to trust? Now, the Nyaya school holds that these are all the possible different ways that we could come to know something, whether to know something is true or whether to know that something exists. So, when the Nyaya is going to defend the view that the self exists, it has to use one or more of these sources of knowledge. And so this sets us up to look at, in the next lectures, the Nyaya view that there is a self and that we have knowledge of it. And we'll have to know that through one or more of these knowledge sources.